Well, now it's time to talk about the Steam Next Fest. So if you aren't familiar, you should be. Steam Next Fest is really cool. It is essentially an indie game festival that Steam puts on every, from the looks of it, a couple times a year, where for 1 week, a bunch of developers put demos, a bunch of indie developers put demos of their upcoming games on Steam or release new demos if they already, had one out. And then, depending on the developer's choice, some of them it'll only be available for that week, for that 1 week. Some of them, I think, keep them up, but it's not a given. And so there's like a time-limited FOMO element. So I'm here to tell you about 8 games that I checked out, and some of the ones that I thought were worth you checking out, that I would recommend, and what I thought of them. So the first one was a game that I got actually recommended to me on Reddit as just a random, hey, check out this game, it's really weird. It's called Indika. 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 This is actually a game out of Kazakhstan, which is pretty interesting. Apparently, the developer was formerly based in Moscow, but for whatever reason, relocated to Kazakhstan. They are a very indie dev. They have one game on Steam to their name, and it's a VR game. And as far as I'm concerned, basically every VR game is a tech demo. So this is like a full-on game now. I'm sorry if I'm being condescending. Anyway, Indika. This game is really cool. I liked it a lot. Essentially, Indika, I was drawn by the page because it did look weird. It has a pretty photoreal art style, but there's these kind of flashes of weirdness. The game has this photorealism, but then kind of like weird pixel like voxel type objects for certain gameplay mechanics that like aren't supposed to really be existing in the world. It takes place in the real world. The soundtrack is also kind of like techno-y, like kind of a little chiptune inspired, which is neat. And okay, so let's get into what the game is actually about. So this is a very like narrative, dialogue-driven game with environmental puzzle solving. Yeah, that's how I would describe it. It's a third-person game. You play as okay, so let me just give you the quick plot synopsis because I think you're probably going to be sold on the plot before anything else. The main character is a nun named Indika. She is. It takes place in late 1800s Russia during the winter in the countryside, absolutely snowed in. The main character is a nun who can hear the devil, and an escaped convict who can hear God. So Indika is this nun who is. You kind of have to. It starts with both of them passed out in the snow, and they kind of wake up. And they have a motorcycle that's tipped over nearby them. And you kind of piece together from their conversations the events that directly preceded the start of the game. Sort of spoilers. If that premise sounded interesting to you, I would maybe skip to, I don't know, the next segment. The demo doesn't cover it covers it's about an hour long, 40 minutes to an hour long, depending on how long certain puzzles take you, I imagine. But just skip, because I do want to talk about a little bit of the plot, because it did hook me. This game actually has pretty interesting characters. And good voice acting, too, which I'm pleasantly surprised at. I wouldn't necessarily expect a Kazakhstani developer to have been able to source good English voice actors, but they do. It is in English, by the way. I don't know if there's a different dub. I didn't actually check. So basically what you figure out is that Indika and... who's the other guy? He also had an I name. I'll call him Ivan for now because it's a generic Russian name. So Indika and Ivan were both on this train that was going to wherever. Indika was on the way to a monastery to deliver a letter. And Ivan was a prisoner who I believe was being transported from like a prison to a hospital or vice versa. He has an infected arm. He has an arm with a wound, and it's infected. So he isn't very physically capable. At some point, there was some kind. He took her as a hostage and escaped from the train, and now they're both in this situation in the middle of the winter in the Russian countryside, and they're like, shit. Well, all right, we're in the situation now. We got to find some kind of shelter or town or civilization. So there's a lot of back and forth dialogue between the two of them. Again, good performances by both of them. The game has a lot of dark humor, kind of crass humor, but you can tell it's more so that like it's informed by the characters. Ivan is just he just has a kind of like crass sense of humor. He curses more. Indika also has a sense of humor of her own. But they kind of have a good dynamic with each other. She's obviously, she's a nun, so she's a little more interested in, being clean. But their interactions are really charming, and I was always happy when they started talking. I was always I wanted to hear what they would say to each other next and what conversations they would have, because it just really worked for me. So they find this little town that's been completely abandoned. It was a factory town. It was a factory that made paint. Everyone's gone, and it's kind of eerie. The environments have a really nice atmosphere to them. There's a bit where you do some basic puzzle solving. You got to get a wrench to like unscrew a bolt to move this thing out of the way before you can proceed. And you go into to find a wrench, you go into a nearby home. Excuse me. And the detail in this little house is really nice. Like it's pretty like intricate. It's like one room, but there's like a corner, right? There's a corner that has it's this desk with all of this painting and drawing supplies, and there's all these paintings of Jesus but with no eyes, and you're like, that's kind of creepy. And then you kind of you look for another second at the room, and you realize that all over the room are these little sketches of people's eyes, but for some reason none of the Jesus paintings have them. It's kind of eerie. There is some basic interacting. Oh, there's like a weird like sex doll looking thing. It's like this big human-sized wooden doll with a face painted on it that's laying in the bed. Just weird, right? Like, what happened? Who was here? Who was this? I don't know. Will there ever be an answer to that? No clue. There's a lot of pretty simple interaction with the environment. You have these like points that you can build up. I never got to like, okay, so you'll walk into this room, and there's a couple things that you can interact with. You'll be able to pick up, for instance, here's a pendant of a saint or something, and you take that and you earn like 10 points. There's a little like candle shrine to, Saint Mary or something like that. And you can light that, and you'll get some points from that. And then every time you hit a milestone, there's like this little upgrade path where there's there's essentially like a top row and a bottom row. And the top row of options is stuff like what is it, piety or something? And the bottom one is like shame. And piety will be like the next time you gain a point, like points, there's like a chance that you'll get like a multiplier on it. Whereas the shame one is like, get 30 points right now. I'm not sure what the extent of that system will be. There were only 3 kind of like levels of upgrades, and you pick one for each intersection, right? Or not an intersection. It's 2 different paths, and you pick one for each. Every time you get to that threshold, you just pick one of them. You can't develop both of them, as far as I could tell. there was like a big kind of like hexagon shape at the end of those three watermarks, three thresholds. But I never got to that. I don't know if there's actually enough points in the demo for you to reach that. So I don't know where that's going. I'd be curious about it at least. But generally, there's a lot of little details in the environment. You're kind of encouraged to take your time and look around. And there's usually not that many things to actually like interact with, but at least just checking. And little environmental storytelling things that are just strange. Like you walk into a house at one point to grab something, and there's like all these cradles all over the place. There's all these cradles hanging off the ceiling, all empty, of course. There's no living person in this town that you can tell. There's no people at all. It's completely abandoned. There's no bodies. No idea what happened here. At one point, you get a little further in. There's like this kind of wolf that's sort of chasing you. You have to run away from it at a couple points. And eventually you run into this part of the factory building. You hoist Ivan up out of a window, and then he like takes kind of a bad fall and is injured and can't like pull you back up from the other end. So Indika has to find a different way around. And so you walk up this tower, because I guess it's like built into the side of a cliff or something. So the top of the tower ends up at it'll lead out to the cliff. You walk up this tower, and as you're walking up all alone, you start hearing this voice, this narration, and it's the devil, and the devil is coaxing you to read the letter, and Indika's arguing with him like, no, it's sinful to read someone else's letter. I'm not supposed to. And he's goading her into doing it, and he's playing these little mind games like, well, it can't be that big of a sin, right? Because there is, there's big sins and there's small ones. And let's say opening a letter, he's just messing with her like, how do you quantify what a sin is? What if opening a letter is one sin, right? Well, what would a murder be? Would that be worth like 1,000 sins? What if a mailman opens up 1,000 people's letters? Is he a murderer now? And he's just playing these little games with her. And eventually, once you get to the top of the tower, the door just kind of like opens on its own. And you walk into kind of like this last kind of hallway stretch. Or it's kind of like a larger open area, but there's a door at the end. And Indika decides, fine, okay, whatever, I'll read the letter. She opens it up, and you don't find out what it is, but you find out based off of what the devil then tells you, which is that Indika is delivering this letter, which basically informs the head of the monastery that Indika has been defrocked. Great word. She's been kicked out of the convent. You don't know why. You don't know what she did, or what the circumstances are. But as soon as she finds this out, the devil just starts mocking her and laughing at her. And the world literally flies apart. So you're in this room, and like the walls like pull away and like shatter and explode apart. And it's like the room is like floating in this red void, right? Like it doesn't even exist in the real world anymore. And the devil's just laughing at you and taunting you, like asking you like, where are you going to go now? And stuff like that. And here's where I would say the game's other main puzzle mechanic comes in, which is that you can switch between the normal version of the world and the kind of hellish, blown apart version of it, which changes the geometry and the layout of the room so that you can get to the end. That you have to swap between them to get to the end. And you do this by praying. So there is a pray button in this game. Hit the pray button, which I laughed at that when I first saw that. But literally hold down right mouse to pray. And Indika will start praying, and you hear her whispering her prayers, and the world flies back to normal. All the things like shoot back together. So you got to like climb up this thing, like climb up onto a box, then onto a board, walk to the end, stop praying, the world flies apart, now you're over here, but you're like on this, you can kind of drop down to this other thing, start praying again to like shoot back, and now you can walk across this platform that's formed again. You're doing that. It's a really cool mechanic. I really like the way that it's tied into the story and the whole deal with the devil taunting you and all that. But there is like one gripe I have, which is that the devil has this monologue of him taunting you, right? And it's maybe a minute long, and it loops constantly. Excuse me, Jesus. It's always on a loop, which it's fine like the first 2 or even 3 times, but I was stuck in this room for a couple minutes trying to figure out what exactly I was supposed to do, or like where I was supposed to stand, and just kind of trying to get an idea for how to solve it. I mean, it's the first time I've done a puzzle like this in this game, and I'm still kind of like learning how the mechanic works. Listening to that on a loop, because otherwise you have to like just be holding the prayer button down, which only gives you swapping between the 2 versions of the world. Like you kind of have to do that because you have to tell like, okay, plan your route for how it's supposed to work, right? It's useful to be able to look at both versions of the world, but one of them you've got this monologue which you've heard like 10 times already going on in your ear, and it just gets kind of annoying. It wasn't like too bad, but it did get annoying, and in fact I left that bit of feedback. I would at the end survey that they link you to, I was like, my suggestion would just be to have the monologue and then have some kind of like ambient like laughter or a couple like random little like lines that you can pepper in here and there, and then maybe every like 2 or 3 minutes replay the monologue or something like that of time that's passed, if you really want to like have it be a constant thing. But just have it be more of a in the background, because I'm trying to solve a puzzle and I've got this thing kind of bugging me. Gets a little on my nerves. I could imagine later in the game that being a problem if they handle all of those puzzles like that, and one of them is particularly tricky to solve. I can imagine myself getting annoyed after pretty quickly. But yeah, it's the demo is, again, it's about 50 minutes long. It ends on an interesting note. There's this, so the wolf model is like really fucked up looking. It is I didn't even know it was supposed to be like a regular wolf, but I thought it was supposed to be a monster. I think it's just that they didn't know how to like model a wolf that well. It doesn't ruin the game at all. It's just something I thought I would mention. It's a really weird looking wolf. It looks like it's made of like Brillo pads or something. What else was I gonna say? It has a great art style. It's a very like white, black, gray kind of sepia colored game. And it never looks bland. It just looks pale. It's a pale game, but some really beautiful scenes. Like you go into this factory, right? And you're in the kind of the upper level where the light is shining through, and there's these massive gears and this machinery, this huge structure of cogs and pulleys and gears and all that. And you're like walking through, and you got to solve a little puzzle where you do something or other. And little particles of dust catching the light. And it looks really nice. Not particularly colorful, but it fits the mood. And it still manages to look really, really gorgeous. Kind of, it's one of those environments that almost kind of stretches the realism, because it's so massive and grand feeling, and it's really good looking. I thought. Yeah, I really dug this demo. I don't think there's really anything else that I wanted to say. But Indika, yeah, Indika. You can wishlist it. I did. I am very interested to see how it pans out. I think if it can deliver on the characters and the story, and they keep it as this kind of interesting small cast of characters dynamic, where you've got, I didn't even mention the whole like listening to God thing, but he basically, because it doesn't go into too much detail, but essentially he tells you that a few weeks ago he heard, he had a cup of water, and while he was drinking it, he heard God whisper in his ear and tell him the future of everything that was going to happen. And according to him, everything that God said has come true. So there's this obvious setup of the nun who's supposed to be pure is being tempted by the devil, and like what's her decision going to be, and this convict who is you don't know what he's done, but maybe something bad, but he literally has like an injury that is rotting, like he has an infection. It's like a very physical symbol. The symbolism's there already in his character, this infection that's weakened him. And he's the one who God chooses to speak to, but not Indika, right? So there's this contrast between them. And I thought it was interesting that one of the items that you pick up to get some points, it's a pendant of Saint Christopher, who I think is one of my favorite saints, just because he is always depicted as having a dog head. He was a cynocephaly, which was like back in the medieval period when people didn't leave their, like, they didn't go beyond, a lot of people didn't leave like a 20-mile radius around their village. People would just be like, hey, did you know there's like a race of dog people? You'd be like, what? And they're like, yeah, one of them is a saint. Well, that's crazy. But yeah, that's, despite being a beast, like it literally tells you in the description of the pendant, despite being like a dog-headed man, being an animal man, he was still able to accept God's grace and become a saint. And so there's these very intentional feeling little points to suggestions of characters being redeemed, potentially characters, having falls. And I think if the story can deliver on that, if it can keep up the great dialogue and dynamic between the two main characters, and just deliver some, again, pretty serviceable environmental puzzles where you're just, not too difficult to figure out, but satisfying nonetheless, I think it could be a really great game. I would definitely keep my eye out for it. Indika.